Welcome to yet another episode of The Big Picture. Last week, the World Economic Forum's annual meeting happened between the 19th and 23rd at Davos. One of the key things that we noted was the commentary, was the speech by Carney, the Honorable Prime Minister of Canada, who exposed the duplicity of the hegemon without naming it in enforcing a rules-based international order. He called out the myth behind the international rules-based order, essentially saying that it never existed, and when it was enforced, it was based on who the victim was. So essentially, one of the hallowed members of the G7 calling out the duplicity of the hegemon is something very interesting to note. Now, when one by one we have noticed that, starting from the European Union and now Canada calling this out. Now, what it really means is it's breaking. It's breaking at a pace which probably no one anticipated 2 years ago or even a year ago. When we talk about this rules-based order, what do we mean here? There is a host of multilateral organizations, the UN, WHO, WTO, and even the NATO. Now, some of the NATO members have been very critical. Now, if you go back in history, you will realize that NATO is the basis that ensured that the European nations did not build military technology. NATO is the basis on which both the CTBT and the NNPT have been signed. Europe agreed to sign because US offered them protection. Now, if Europe is going to be questioning the existence of NATO or the effectiveness of NATO, it's something that's not good. What we see is Europe rearming, and we have seen this. I mean, when we look back at the performance of thematics in Europe, we do see European defense doing phenomenally well over the last 1.5 years. Now, in such a situation, when Europe is going to be rebuilding its military infrastructure or military hardware, what do you do as an investor? Where do you want your money to be invested in? And around the same time, we also notice that France, a nuclear power and a member of NATO, instituting a rule that mandates that in the next 1.5 years, that most of the public sector, or rather the state communication, would shift from US-centered platforms, which is MS Teams or Zoom, to something which is more built in Europe or built in France. This is something very similar to India did with its homegrown platform. Now, the closest neighbor to US calling out US as a hegemon and the lack of existence of a rules-based order, and a country like France moving away from US technology to something more European in nature. What does it mean for us? We have two key takeaways. The first one, which I already mentioned, is European defense. The second one is this is probably the tipping point for the hyperscalers, or rather the tipping point for many of these US tech platforms. These platforms do not have access to the market in China, and the next biggest market, which is Europe, is slowly moving away from them. And India is something which is also a big market, which is kind of moving away from the US tech as well. Do we see a complete ban of US tech in these other markets? We don't think so. But these are all signals that kind of points to a point where the exalted valuations of the US tech companies could be under question. So we have been calling this out. We have been recommending. We have been suggesting. I wouldn't say recommending, but we have been suggesting that if you are a Indian investor with heavy exposure to US technology, or an Indian living in the US with exposure to US technology, you should be looking at exiting. When we also examine Mark Carney's speech at WEF, there was a clarion call for the middle powers. When he says middle powers, he says Canada, India, UK, everybody else, and many of the European countries, to come together. Is this the point where some members of the West, who have been part of NATO, who have been part of many of these international alliances, like say G7 or G20, move away, and we start seeing alliances which is ex-US being formed. While we don't think so that it could happen very fast, but this is not a probability that we can discount that easily. The development of the last 1 week and even the couple of weeks before, the way US invaded Venezuela, makes us wonder if it is the right time to get out of investing in the US and look for opportunities elsewhere. And to us, European manufacturing, European defense, and Europe in general offers that opportunity. We'll see you soon with yet another episode of The Big Picture. Thank you.